So I want to welcome everyone tonight. My name is Neil Parker, and I am a programs and exhibit specialist here at the Arlington Heights Memorial Library. This program tonight is another partnership brought to you by the Arlington Heights Memorial Library, the Glenview Public Library, and the Northbrook Public Library. We're so happy that you all are spending your evening with us. I'm excited to introduce tonight's program, which is a continuation of our 33 and a third series, each one following a Bloomsbury book on a particular classic album. This is our second to last program tonight. So we've made it almost a whole year. I'm super excited about that. Tonight's program is going to be about a classic album from 1963 that was shelved for over 20 years, Sam Cooke's Live at the Harlem Square Club, 1963. So now let me introduce Colin Fleming. Hey, Colin, how's it going?
What's up, my friend?
Colin is author of 8 books and a myriad form of fiction, who is also an expert in and writes widely on film, literature, music, art, and sports, and his op-eds on current and cultural events and ideas are featured in many major newspapers. This is just a snapshot. Honestly, go to Colin's website and check out his stuff. His works appeared in Harper's, the Iowa Review, the Atlantic, Rolling Stone, Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Daily Beast, San Francisco Chronicle, Washington Post, The New Yorker, Spin, Esquire, Vanity Fair, Slate, and I'm just going to go with etc. after that, Colin. Is that cool?
Yeah, and I am a man who apparently can't work Zoom, so I'm upstairs in the bedroom of a kind neighbor who has let me use their computer. So here we are.
Zoom. Hey man, I have an absolute respect for that. Like, that was kind of the cool thing when we first started talking, is you were like, this is not my thing. It's better to just call me on the phone and talk things out that
way. You should have heard my frantic, terrified, pathetic knock on the door to be let in, and here I am. Yeah.
Well, we're all happy you're here, man. It wouldn't be rock and roll without this kind of stuff, dude.
No, it's like the band in front of me. It's like they got stage fright and I had to go in before I was ready to do my set, but it doesn't matter. It's like that whole Eye of the Tiger thing, rocking, ready to go. Sam Cooke, all that good stuff. This book, this album, this meant a lot to me. And I think it's something I've learned too, that when I was beginning to do this book, a lot of people were like, oh, I love that album. It was like an album that if you heard of it, it was bound to be just one of your all-time like go-to sort of discs. There was no one who's like, I'm mildly into it. Everyone was just like impassioned about it who has heard it. And I think that's really one of the best things that we can say about really the best art. That's what you're going for. And that's certainly what Sam Cooke was able to achieve with this record.
Yeah, no, for sure, man. So I got a little backstory on this record, and then I'll start to get into some questions. But like, growing up, my dad was super into Sam Cooke, super into like, you know, Marvin Gaye, Jackie Wilson, all those dudes. The Sam Cooke that I heard was all kind of the, you know, the songs that we all recognize, you know, kind of the pretty stuff. So I discovered this record in college, and it sort of blew me away because it was like unexpected in terms of like anything I had heard from Sam Cooke before. Let me do a little blurb here and then toss it over to you. So this record, Live at the Harlem Square Club, was shelved for over 20 years, and it stands alongside Otis Redding's Live in Europe, and James Brown's Live at the Apollo as one of the finest live soul albums ever made. It also reveals a musical, spiritual, emotional, and social journey played out over one night on the stage of a sweaty Miami club, as Cooke made music that encapsulated everything he had ever cut, channeling forces that would soon birth A Change Is Gonna Come, the most important soul song ever written. Here's the book, highly recommended. How did you get into this this record?
Oh, I would say because I'm an explorer, and one thing you're into leads to another thing that you become into in time. And that was just how I always was, whether it was with literature or like if you listen to the Beatles, for instance, and you're hearing Please Please Me, you start to think, oh, who does that song, Anna? And from there, you get back to Arthur Alexander. So I was just someone who always ranged that way. And I think that's a way that we should endeavor to be all the time, no matter what age we come to. So I would have become familiar with this record just because I was always reading about rock and soul, and I was into it. And I think like the Sam Cooke that most people know, when you immediately think, oh, Sam Cooke, you think oldie station, you're riding around in the car with your parents, You Send Me comes on, and songs of high school romance and What a Wonderful World, all that kind of stuff. And so this particular record that was, like you said, shelved for all those years until 1985, it was recorded in the winter of '63 in this essentially all black neighborhood in Miami, is what we would think of as like a more pungent version of Sam Cooke, a more earthier version. This is what you would have got if you were in the know and were going out to hear his road show that featured his African American band, which was different than the white band or largely white band that he would cut like his supper club shows with. So in essence, it's like the loam. This is as nitty gritty and real as, I don't even just want to say soul music is or has gotten. I would say that all of the music ever produced in this republic has ever been in this country.
Yeah, no, man, for sure. That's like one aspect of this record that really sort of like stuck with me. So I'm like listening to it early on and kind of eventually started piecing it together, because when I first discovered it, like no one that I knew had heard this record before. I ended up getting it like, I think at like Reckless Records in Chicago. Just sort of looking for this, looking to kind of expand a little bit more. And like, I mean, you go into this in the book a little bit. I mean, I think you say like, man, I forget the guitar player, but like sort of has almost like a Ramonesy sort of feel to it. So like I'm listening to it, it's like so much raw, and just the audience that you can hear going wild, in the background really, kind of draws you in.
Yeah, I would say that we also have to be careful though not to get hung up on labels of rawness, because rawness seems to almost preclude finesse. And what Sam Cooke was doing at this show was writing on the stage. And we don't think of Sam Cooke as a writer for various reasons. Like you don't picture Sam Cooke sitting there with a guitar like you picture Lennon and McCartney or Dylan or someone like that, but he was of their qualitative ilk in the 1960s. I mean, the thing that Sam Cooke was best at, it wasn't even singing, it wasn't band leading, it was writing. So what we're hearing him do at this particular show is going a long way to writing. And I think this is really the crux of the book, and the crux of Sam Cooke's artistry is writing what I would say is one of the two most significant songs in the history of this country. You have the one in Strange Fruit from Billie Holiday, and the strange fruit of the title is referring to lynched black bodies in the trees in the South. And then you have Sam Cooke's A Change Is Gonna Come, which is this paean to a future that I think we're still in search of. And it's not even just a black and white thing, it's a treat people as what they are type of thing. And that goes across all of the different columns of culture. It's not just BLM and things of that nature, but there are all kinds of different ways we discriminate against people. And so I think Sam Cooke at this particular show, as raw and raucous and all of that great stuff that it was, he was on his way to doing something that is of a significance. Like there's a reason, for instance, that a composer like Schubert comes up as much as he does in the book, because when we look at the two, they actually have a lot in common. And if you just know Sam Cooke from the oldies, or even just Sam Cooke from his earthiness at this gig, you might not be thinking that way, but there's a deeper story there.
And so there's a lot going on with that. You do talk about him as a songwriter, and I'm going to go back to, just a second when you were talking about him as like a singer, and you said, I mean, in the book, great singer, not the best singer that ever exists, although people will put him up on that pedestal. Can you explain that a little bit?
Sure. He gets that kind of lazy designation of, a lot of people will say best singer ever. It's almost like people in baseball will say Pete Rose, best player ever. But if you actually parse the numbers, Pete Rose isn't even really close to being technically one of the best baseball players ever. There are a lot of sort of extracurriculars and intangibles that go into that. So if we're just talking in terms of technique, Ella Fitzgerald, for instance, could sing circles around Sam Cooke. She could sing circles around Billie Holiday, but Billie Holiday was able to emote in a way that maybe Ella Fitzgerald couldn't quite reach. So a lot of people will say that Sam Cooke is their favorite singer ever. He's the best singer ever. But I don't think they're even really talking about the timbre of his voice so much as they're talking about his ability to connect with us. And a work of art, it's impossible for a work of art to be more powerful than its penchant and ability to connect with us. That's everything. It's not the same as technique necessarily. It's the point, though. And Sam Cooke was the singer in the soul idiom, who I guess you could say sang with the most amount of point, if you will.
Yeah, no, that made sense, man. Can you get into a little bit about Sam Cooke as a songwriter? So, there are a lot of big names that come up in this book, not only just like Schubert or Billie Holiday. I mean, John Coltrane comes up in terms of his voice, his vocal stylings, that kind of stuff. I mean, even Wayne Gretzky and Muhammad Ali pop up in this book. It's really interesting. Can you describe a little bit of Sam as a songwriter? Because I do think you're right that might be something that a lot of folks don't know about him.
He was quite Chekhovian. And what I mean by that is the Russian writer Chekhov would write these short stories that seem to belie their word count. You'd think there'd be this entire novel, and then you do a word count, and it's like a 2,700 word story, if that. And so someone like Chekhov, like Sam Cooke, would stack these details, these observations, like in Sam Cooke, that song, the songs are in the icebox, everyone's having the party. It's just that sort of minutia that stacks. And when you stack well-observed minutia, you end up with narrative. So Sam Cooke's songs function as a kind of sonic literature. They sound great, but so does some of the prose of like F. Scott Fitzgerald. You get to the end of Great Gatsby, it's and as I sat there brooding on the old unknown world. It's very sing-song because of that. And as I sat there brooding, it's A-E-I-O-U. He's playing upon that sonic cadence. And Sam Cooke would write his music the same way, and he'd write it to fit his voice. So like Mozart often, when he was writing an opera, would think, oh, I really like what she can do, that alto singer. He'd write specifically for her. Sam Cooke would write specifically for himself. It's why there are some great covers of Sam Cooke songs, but there aren't a lot. There aren't like great covers really, unless you want to count Otis Redding, of A Change Is Gonna Come. The Animals do a version of Bring It On Home to Me, but they don't do it in the Sam Cooke vein, because you really can't divide the writing from the singing, the performing. They're all going hand in hand with this guy. So it was not a way that other people really wrote or performed.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, you even get into some of the nuance with the way he'll sing a pronoun like I, in concert, in the concert, or how he'll, just like hold the before, a phrase that he's going to sing. And, just thinking about it, in that regard, I think that's sort of similar to, kind of along the part where you're maybe comparing him a little bit, or not comparing him, but bringing up like the Coltrane stuff and the phrasing and that sort of thing.
It is jazzy in a way. It's not like in the jazz idiom, but look, when any of us write anything, we're writing and editing at the same time. When I'm talking right now, I'm writing and editing because I'm thinking of these words, and I get 4 words in and I'm thinking, oh, I want to change that next word. It gets effaced before I get to it. So you're always sort of, it's like when people make films, we hear that expression, it was shot in the camera, meaning that it wasn't sort of pieced together on the editing floor. Sam Cooke sang in the camera. And so that's very much a Coltrane-esque conceit. That's what John Coltrane did, Sheets of Sound, and he's up there at the Village Vanguard, November 1961, and he's doing his thing. He's a great writer, but he's a great improviser, because that's what you're doing when you're improvising. Writing is improvising. It's just really is almost like a time component thing. We think, oh, I'm sitting here writing, I'm laboring and all that stuff. But maybe some people just think faster and write in the moment. Because like, for instance, Dickens, he was at some boring agricultural meeting one day, and he's like, this sucks. I don't want to be here. I'm going to take a walk. He goes and takes a walk. He comes up with the whole of A Christmas Carol in like minutes. But the whole thing is however many words it is a novella. But how do you even measure that time? So Sam Cooke would sort of write in that out of time way, like a jazz musician, but he just wasn't playing jazz.
Gotcha, man. So the backstory to this record is pretty interesting. Definitely, like we talked about before, different than what maybe like a white audience would expect to hear. Can you give us some background on the show, like how it came together, the recording, and also why it was shelved for over 20 years?
Sure. So this is, as you said, it's definitely not what you'd expect if you were a white fan of Sam Cooke's music at the time. I almost think of it like the Everly Brothers, because the Everly Brothers are very white in a way, but they'd have hits on the rhythm and blues chart. And so Sam Cooke made music where it was safe for the white teen suburban sleepover. You'd listen to that kind of music. That was a big demo for him. So like if you were one of those girls and you convinced your parent to take you to like a show like this, you'd be in for something that you would never see coming. So he's out on the road, and in a way it's glorious, this show. And we think, wow, it's like manna, it's this one-off. But it really wasn't. This is what was happening when you were a road band on a bus on the so-called Chitlin circuit in the South. And the label, RCA, just thought, well, live albums are cheap. I mean, you always think about like, when did the Who put out Live at Leeds? It's in between Tommy and Who's Next, because it's like, just take the mobile studio out there, it'll be fine. It was a cheap way to make a record and make money. So they record 2 performances at the same venue. We do not have the other performance. It would be like this remarkable grail type of document. But we have this one show that, as we talked about, was shelved for over 2 decades. It's conjecture as to why that was. One reason would be that people wouldn't have been ready for this kind of rawness at the time. But let's keep in mind, live albums weren't even really a thing in rock and soul for the most part, like until 1968. You have Cream's Wheels of Fire, you have Yeah Yeahs the next year with the Stones. Live albums were rare at the time in the early 60s. You had Bo Diddley's Beach Party from like the same year, but they were low fidelity for the most part. They weren't what audiences expected. So yeah, there's the rawness, but it's also like really not the way the recording industry was going at the time. So it was easy to shelve it. Why it was shelved until 85, and you could go to the record store. Think of this. You can go to the record store and be like, I will have the Smiths' Hatful of Hollow and this Sam Cooke album. I mean, you'd be pretty cool. Maybe it's a guy like you in college. But
sure.
but it just sat around. It wasn't something you really read about. It wasn't something you knew about. Like there are things we know about, like the Beatles and the long first take of Helter Skelter and all that stuff. This was just kind of a thing that was in trade papers at the time, dropped, and then it appeared. And then me, like in, I don't know, the very early 90s, I'm like, Mom, Dad, I'd like to know what I had coming for Christmas. It gave me something to look forward to. It's just like books. So they go to like the Borders and buy me like all of like Proust. And the people at the bookstore would be like, oh, that sucks, poor kid. They're like, no, he's weird, he's into it. This was one of the things. Crack this bad boy open on Christmas. And I'm like, Dad, it is time for rock and soul. He's like, whatever, I'm going to go make the egg pie, but fine, that's cool. I just wore the hell out of the thing listening to it.
Nice. So I do want to come back to the Billie Holiday connection here. So in the book, you do say that Strange Fruit and Change Can Come are, really like the pinnacle of American songwriting, American soul music. I don't know. I don't want to, put words in your mouth, man. Can you get into that a little bit more in terms of what it means? You have a really good way of talking about its importance at the time, socially, its importance to the Black community, those songs, but also how those songs can resonate with, a white kid in college or something like that, how they can kind of speak to all of us.
So I plan to be doing this Billie Holiday book, and we can talk about it later. It actually started life as a Billie Holiday book, but I was at Starbucks, same place I was at, same one I was at a couple hours ago. And it was a couple of years ago, and Strange Fruit by Billie Holiday came on the sound system, which is really an odd choice for like Starbucks as you're getting your latte. And all these people are sitting around, and they all have like the laptops and the right stickers and signage. Lip service. There's nothing real. People, I'm so into this. It's like, something will come along next week and you'll be into that. Are you really into anything? And everyone was just going about their life, and they didn't even, I could have wept, not just like sort of for the apathy, but you hear this song, and she didn't write Strange Fruit, but she would make a point in concert of saying it was written for her. I talk about this live version from 1945 in the book. And it was the type of song that when you went to one of her shows, you would have had a hard time listening to it. It is the definition of audible songsmith pain. It's just harrowing, I think, is a word that we'd have to use for it. And so Sam Cooke did this album, an homage album for Billie Holiday called Tribute to the Lady. And he took on some of her songs because that's what you had to do with Billie Holiday. You had to take them on. It wasn't just like, it wasn't covering Jerry and the Pacemakers. Do you know what I mean? It was something that it didn't ask of your lips and your larynx so much as it asked of your soul. And Sam Cooke was later going to do his version of Strange Fruit. He never covered the song directly, but he writes this song, A Change Is Gonna Come. And Sam Cooke is this hit maker. He's a businessman. He was very money conscious. He was way into money, like almost venal about it. He writes this song, A Change Is Gonna Come, and it's this sort of urban pastoral, which is this paradoxical mashup. It's not what's supposed to happen. He plays it like for some buddies, and they're like, it sounds like death, man. You can't do that. Yeah, it sounds like death, but it also sounds like sort of the angel welcoming you in at the gates of heaven. There's an incredible, boundless hope in the song that might not have been in Strange Fruit. It's a progression. Strange Fruit is a song of endurance, whereas A Change Is going to Come is this next logical step. It's still about endurance, but it's about getting to that place to which one has set out to go. And Sam Cooke has already sung to us, You Send Me. He is that man who is self-sent. In other words, he has character, he has purpose. A lot of times we get our marching orders from what's around us and what's trending on Twitter. But for Sam Cooke, the engine was an internal one, and that was within himself. And I think A Change Is Gonna Come is the sound of that. Now, A Change Is Gonna Come does not happen without nights like this one in Miami in the winter of 1963. You can thread through the performance and you can see the devices, the compositional devices coming out in his singing that are going to make that song happen. So it's like you're watching, like you see a nature film, and it's like there is some animal stalking the zebra, and you know how it's going to play out. If you know how to hear this record, you are on a path to what is going to be the most significant song since that decade of the 60s, when it seemed like so many songs were of such global and cultural and zeitgeisty and American significance.
Yeah, you had the sort of the comparison, and in the book you make it real clear. Sam Cooke paid attention to the music that was going on around him, listened to Dylan like crazy. So you use Blowing in the Wind as kind of an example, of that. But how Dylan's song is almost, I'm gonna maybe hopefully not invent a word, but platitudinal. It uses these platitudes to try to get the idea across, whereas Sam Cooke just takes a different track with it. Was he listening to a lot of Dylan at the time?
It was. I wouldn't say that Dylan was so much platitudinous as he was using that sort of hoary, with an H, songsmithing technique of the broadside. He was using almost like the newspaper headline. And that was something that he would have learned from a Woody Guthrie, that painting in broad strokes, but there's still an emotional filigree there. It's not just all broad strokes. So I think Sam Cooke, who covered Blowing in the Wind, he understood what Dylan was up to. But really what you want to do, and Dylan did it, Sam Cooke just did it a different way. You want to have something that's universal, that you think like, oh, I'm in there and we're all in there. But at the same time, it feels like you're the only one in there and it's just for you. And you want everyone to have that feeling in a different way. So I might be swarthy, but I'm not an African American, but I can listen to A Change Is Gonna Come with things that I've gone through in my life, the things that I'm pressed into service to endure and hopefully get past. And it's going to have a resonance with me. So I never wanted the book to just be this kind of like shilling for black and white and black and all that kind of stuff, because that to me limits Sam Cooke, the musical and artistic humanist. And it's too easy to do that. We see that happen with Billie Holiday, and the college girl puts up the poster of Billie Holiday and she's never listened to her music to show that she's one of the good ones. I'm not interested in any of the would-be good ones. I'm interested in the real ones. And that's why I guess I've always been interested in Sam Cooke.
Do you have a favorite song from the record?
Yeah, well, it's like one of those things where those, you ever like, you're somewhere and you're bored. Like I remember I used to like go to church as a kid and I'd be ranking Beatles records in my mind. I seem like all devout, but I'm like, Abbey Road slides ahead of Revolver this week. So that happens with this record, where I think the version of Bring It On Home to Me. But the coolest thing to me is that You Send Me, the song that starts Sam Cooke on his solo career, because he's a member of a gospel group called the Soul Stirrers. And I'm writing about him and them now for the Library of Congress because of this book. But he's in the Soul Stirrers for like half a dozen years. So he's in the Soul Stirrers for like as long as the Beatles were a commercial entity, like to give you like an idea temporally. And then he does You Send Me. When we get to the You Send Me version on Live at the Harlem Square Club, it's not even listed in the track listing on any of the various versions of the album. Like, it's, you know how you go to like a Dylan show and you don't know what he's playing at first, and then it's Mr. Tambourine Man and he's arranged it in such a different way.
Yep.
There is like this quasi metal rap version, seismic sort of garage rock, You Send Me, that is this sort of bridge song on the Harlem Square Club record. And he, like the chords, the bass, the rumbling of the bass, it's like enough to shift tectonic plates, like the rumbling of it. And he builds to this just vocal crescendo that is some of the most intense of all music you'll find in recorded sound. I would go for that song that's hidden away, that's there, that you notice, that doesn't even get the listing. It's like, this song is so significant and so amazing, don't even need to be in your track listing. I mean, I love that kind of thing. It makes me want to like lower my shoulder right now and like pop somebody, but it's just me.
No, man, it's cool. And then it goes like goes straight into Bring It On Home, right? Like he gets that build, right, and then it just like flies right in, man. It's so great.
It's like one of those things where you say it's almost too much, but you mean it in a good way. Mm-hmm. But like you have to sit down or you have to fly around or run some stairs or something like that. And I was going through a bad time in my life. I'd listen to this walking around Boston. This is in the book too, like before dawn in the winter. This would be playing, just trying to find a way to keep going. And it was like, you almost sort of look up to the sky and it's like, it's too low. Like you're going to pop right through it. And not a lot of art, however much you love art and however wide you explore art, not a lot of it can make you feel that way.
That's true. Yeah, that whole record, yeah, I'm with you on that too. That whole crescendo with You Send Me and then going into Bring It On Home, but really just the whole build throughout the entire record and the interplay that Sam Cooke has with the audience. Maybe you could speak on that a little bit. Sort of just his improvisational, like talking, like this back and forth that he's got going on with the audience. And I mean, how tuned in they are with it. I mean, the Grateful Dead comes up in here and there's almost like that, consciousness of like locked consciousness between the band and the audience sort of thing. And I think, there's aspects of this going on at that concert as well.
Well, there's a real symbiosis. It's like the sea anemone and the clownfish. He's up there doing his thing. And he clearly has expectations of his audience beyond like, you will come, it'll be fun, I'll make some nice music, dance around. They're doing call and response with him, and they're almost going as fast mentally as he's going. He's counting on them to supply parts like harmonies in songs. It's very strange. There are all of these weird harmonic things going on the record. He is, for instance, one of the only vocalists I've ever heard who will attempt to harmonize with himself. So he'll sing like the actual lead vocal and the harmony. In one instance, he is so overworked that he uses his fist against his chest as a percussive device. Like you think it's like a floor tom from the drummer, but it's actually the man's chestal cavity. So that's how somatic, that's how bodily infused this recording is. So he's riffing off the audience, and they're getting into it too. They're sharp. And so they're just all moving in this tandem. And you get to the last song of the concert, having a party. I mean, if ever there was a sound of people having a party, I always picture everyone standing up and sort of congoing around. Like, you can feel through the speakers the energy in the room. It's like if people have like that Geiger counter and it's like, oh, this is what happened here. Some bomb went off once. I feel like there's just a residual energy that bakes into you when you hear this. It's just one of the most purely adrenalized. We talk of Dylan, and you think of him at like the Manchester Free Trade Hall in May of 1966, and he's screaming like a Rolling Stone at these people, specifically at this guy who just called him Judas for switching over to electric music. And he's channeling that kind of anger. Sam Cooke has an anger, and we see it in some of the songs, Chain Gang, for instance, but he's channeling it with great joy. So you have this sort of, again, a paradoxical conundrum that was endemic to Cooke.
You touch on this a little bit in the book too, like sort of the way that Sam Cooke was able to code switch back and forth between, maybe some of the Dick Clark shows, teeny bopper shows or whatever. And then the shows that he would play for, Black audiences, seemed really successful. And in doing that, can you touch on that a little bit?
He had a lot of respect for, like, yes, Dick Clark was like the high prince of the teeny boppers. But when he was on some of those shows, people would engage with Cooke on an intellectual level. And he was happy to have that done. People tended to speak to Cooke not as if he was like some mere singer. I don't think that's how he came across. Part of it was how he carried himself. And yet this man who carried himself a certain way was, in other regards, not a good guy, like a sort of constant philanderer. His death, and people might know about this, is we still don't even know what really happened, but like he tried to do something to one woman and then apparently something to two women, and he's found like dead, shot, wearing one shoe. I feel like anytime like you're found with just one shoe, you've probably not been up to like the greatest stuff in the world. But he was able to, again, like the Everly Brothers, like Elvis Presley. First time John Lennon hears Elvis Presley on the radio, he didn't think he was some white guy from the South. And by the same token, the first time John Lennon heard Chuck Berry, he didn't think he was an African-American guy. He thought he was a white guy. So Sam Cooke, he was chameleonic. He was able to move from, it's not even manipulative. I don't want to make it sound that way. He just was someone self-aware as an artist who was conscious of his demos. And sometimes your demos overlap. Look, I write on so many different things. I have some people who think I'm just like Beatles guy. Other people think I'm just hockey guy. Other people think I'm fiction guy. And then he's this kind of fiction guy or that kind of fiction guy. And then they'll think that I'm like not the same guy, or I hire out my name. Sometimes the demos overlap. Sometimes they don't. Sometimes that has to do with people's lack of curiosity or the sloth, or just that they go by whatever is most readily put in front of their face, or put in front of their face first. Sam Cooke's like, yeah, I'll make it work for me. And he did. And so he was able to play to these different demographics. And I think that also informed his sound, because his sound could become this amalgamation of all of these different demographics. You talk about A Change Is Going to Come. It's a pastoral. It's like a Vaughan Williams type of piece, but it's also like Andrew Hill's, what was going to be called Cadaver from his jazz album. It's like John Coltrane's Alabama, lamenting this tragedy in that state, this sort of like piece of civic jazz. So you had all these, but I think you want all these different things at once. Melville, all the people I've cared about were either different things at once or different things throughout their careers, but you always knew it was them, whether it was within the space of a clause or a sung line in Cooke's case. And again, it just comes back to the idea of, I think that's the art that lasts the most and is the most also at the same time timely.
Yeah, the universal quality comes across in the book really well. I just got one more for you, and then we'll turn it over to the audience, Colin. What was the process of writing this book like, or the whole process of working with it through the 33 and a third kind of deal? Was this the first one you wrote for them?
Yeah, you're only allowed to do the one. It's one and done, and then
Okay.
they move you on out. So you and I were speaking one time. I was going to do one on Billie Holiday, and I don't think this is telling tales out of school, because the people who were in charge at the time, there's a guy named Kevin Detmar, and he was a professor. He is a professor. You could write him if you wanted to, at Pomona College. And on Friday, we agreed to have me write a book in the series. He's no longer with the series, on Billie Holiday's Lady in Satin, which was her penultimate album and the last album that was released in her lifetime. And Monday comes around and he says, he writes this in an email. Don't tell anyone this, but you're a white guy and I just would be nervous having you write about like a black woman. Thinking like, dude, no one writes about Billie Holiday more than I do. And thank you, actual racist. So he was sort of shunted out. They moved along, better people. I do the Sam Cooke thing. And I don't know if this is dramatic or the opposite of dramatic, but writing it, I write like 5,000 words a day. So I wrote the book in 15 days while I was writing all my other stuff. And someone might be like, oh no, it's such a rush job. If it was, I wouldn't tell you that. I'd be like, oh, wow. I labored. It was like crawling through the desert for many a moon, a month of Sundays times 12. But I'm confident enough in the work and the prose that it reveals what it is. But I go at a brisk pace.
It's excellent, man. Bill, if you're there, I'm going to toss it over to you and we can get into some of the audience questions. Colin, always a pleasure, man. I've enjoyed our phone conversations and our texts, and I'll pop on at the end before we say goodbye to everyone. So yeah, cool. See you guys in a bit.
Thanks, Neil. Colin, that was excellent. Thank you so much for being here tonight. There are some questions on the side here that I'll read off to you and see if you have some answers for some of these. There's one that says, Colin, if you saw fairly recent film One Night in Miami, I wondered what you think of the depiction of Sam Cooke. For example, his positions on the pressures to represent the Black community as a cultural and social leader and efforts to do so. Thanks.
Oh, I'm going to sound not charitable and undiplomatic. Do you remember the show Bonanza? Yeah. It was this Western, and you had Hoss and Adam and Little Joe, and Pernell Roberts played Adam. Adam left the show voluntarily because they would divvy up the lines on a complex topic such that each guy got one line that one normal person would usually say. That's what that cartoonish kind of film movie was to me, where it's like you're just going to sort of put the fortune cookie bromide in someone's mouth and someone's going to say the right thing at the right. We're talking about an organic, earthy album and an organic, earthy artist in Sam Cooke. So I thought that was antithetical to anything I've ever heard with the man's art itself. And I don't even want to necessarily say that the heart was in the right place. I would say more that like the investiture and dollar signs was in the right place, but no, that wasn't for me. It was a lot of sheen and no substance.
Okay. There's a question here from an Aaron Cohen, who I believe is one of your colleagues and an author of the Aretha Franklin Amazing Grace. I think that's him. So he said, yes, Colin, you mentioned in the book tonight about Sam Cooke as band leader. Could you talk about what made the musicians in this band special and what made them so ideal for Cooke on this night?
So I think we talk about like a band is tight. Like if you're in a high school band, whatever, you're doing your thing in the garage, you want to be thought of that way. So this was one of the only albums I've ever heard where right from the band tuning up, which isn't even a thing, it's not proper music, you can tell how tight they are. And jazz bands, small jazz bands of the 1960s get a lot of the sort of praise as tight bands and bands that could improvise. And then later we're going to have that with the Grateful Dead and the Who, but it's not really a rock and soul thing in 63, 64, 65. think about like the Beatles, no one really thought of them as like this improvisational band circa She Loves You, or the Rolling Stones, or anybody. It's not how it was done. So Sam Cooke had this band that was, yeah, they were soul guys, but they were tight as like a Chicago blues band. Aaron's from Chicago. Or just these classic jazz bands that you got with like Andrew Hill's unit, or any group that Eric Dolphy assembled. And a lot of band leading is writing. You're getting people to do things for you on behalf of your song. So like Miles Davis, when he had a second grade quintet in the mid 1960s, he was laying out a lot. He wasn't playing sometimes as much as he would have, because he was more like a conductor, and a conductor is a writer. And so Sam Cooke, the natural writer, was able to conduct. And then he had these guys who were just world beaters on their individual instruments, especially within this context.
Awesome. Okay, Colin, do you think the circumstances of Cooke's death contributed to the decision to shelve the album?
No, because it was already shelved in the chronology. I just think it was, we take flyers on things. We say, let's try it. Let's see what happens. And we're not really investing a lot necessarily. Certainly not a lot of money was invested in the recording of this album. And it comes back and you're hearing things that, if you love the record, they're part of the reason you love it. But sometimes the singing might be slightly off key, or you might hear some woman yell out. Sam Cooke also makes this unfortunate joke for some reason. I don't know why he does it, about leukemia in the middle of a song. He just gets carried away. He's like, oh, I hope I don't have leukemia. It's like, whoa, what are you doing, dude? And it's like, we've all sort of done things like that. Yeah. But maybe if you're sitting there in LA and you're with RCA, you're like, oh, this is very bad. We can't be doing this. Have them do another You Send Me.
Yeah, yeah. All right. There's one more question in here. It says, have you heard Luther Vandross sing Change Is Gonna Come? Have you heard a particularly good version of the song other than Sam Cooke?
I have not heard the Luther Vandross one, but I will put that into the YouTube queue tonight and educate myself. But Otis Redding has probably the most serviceable version. But sometimes what Otis Redding would do is he just would chop out so many words that, like, if you listen to Otis Redding's Respect, there aren't a lot of words in it. He was a guy who preferred to not work with many words. So he almost changes a change is going to come into like a chant, into a stomp, into a vamp, like the type of thing that a band would warm up with. And he's good at that. He can make a lot out of what doesn't seem to be much, but it's not necessarily like a faithful attempt to cover the song, to add to the song and its sort of purpose. But again, it's Otis Redding. And so have you ever listened to something by Otis Redding and been like, I don't want that, get that out of here? I mean, it's Otis Redding.
Right. So one more just popped up here. Luther singing this song at churches. This is just a comment. Luther singing this song at church is really good. The song at church. Okay. And then there's a confirmation that was the Aaron Cohen who asked the question. So he is here. So I think that's it for all the questions that we've got in here. Neil, if you're still around and you wanted to hop back on, that would be cool. Here he comes.
I'm still here.
Do you have any questions? Ask me anything. Surprise me.
What are you listening to now, Colin?
Oh, I wrote it down. That's how thorough I was. Even though I couldn't work the Zoom, I wrote this down because I thought people might want to check out some of this stuff. So it's kind of all over the place. But lately I've been listening to a lot of Wanda Landowska. People might not know who she is. She was this Polish harpsichordist. And I've been listening to her Scarlatti sonatas. And what's really cool about one of them, sort of like timely now. So it's 1940, it's late spring. She's doing her thing in this Paris studio when the Germans decide to invade the city. She keeps playing as the bombs detonate outside. It's actually on the recording, and it doesn't even knock her off like her meter. So there's that. Listen to Stone Roses demos from their first album. Jelly Roll Morton, great jazz artist. His Library of Congress recordings with Alan Lomax from 1938. Oh, and this is cool. If you have a hard time sleeping at night, there's this character actor named Michael Horton, and he played Marley in the 1951 version of Scrooge. I wrote a book about that. So it's sort of like the film version of the Sam Cooke book. He reads these ghost stories. Well, he's dead now. He read them while he was alive. No, while he's a ghost. Of M.R. James. So it's like great to kind of go to sleep to at night. Grateful Dead in Europe in 72, spring, 50th anniversary of that. And I found an alternate recording. It's pretty cool. Of the Beatles' Keep Your Hands Off My Baby by Little Eva. So from the BBC. So you have like the recording that circulated all these years. And then this other tape was discovered of like some kid holding up the transistor radio, whatever it was at the time, to get this this offline Beatles record of one of their very best covers and one of the best John Lennon vocals.
Awesome.
Very cool, man. So I guess I do have a question. So Muhammad Ali comes up in this one. What was his relationship like with Sam Cooke?
They made, it's like a step above a novelty number, but they made some music together. And we have to go back into this time period of the 1960s when Muhammad Ali, Cassius Clay, as he was known, of course, before then, these were decidedly not lip service people. These were like, put your money where your mouth is people. I mean, Muhammad Ali gave up a lot for what he believed in. Whatever you might think of him later, like I'm a huge like Joe Frazier fan, and the way he sort of bullied Joe Frazier and caused him all these problems that in a way went beyond like just mere gamesmanship.
For sure, yeah.
Troubling, but they were close in that they would have been going through the same kind of tribulations. They were retinue guys in the sense, they were friends. And Muhammad Ali, like if we just remember him from sort of like his health problem era, we might not recall what a loquacious guy he was. He was just an incredibly articulate man, a thoughtful man. And you might not think like, oh, a pugilist, but he really was. He was almost like a statesman. Sam Cooke was like a statesman. So you'd have a natural affinity for being friends, having a connection. They would have many sort of fields upon which they'd connect. So he came up in the book because he was part of that time, and he was part of what was ultimately a movement that Sam Cooke soundtracked. I think really that one song that we get to, and thankfully he lived long enough to get to it, it was close with The Change Is Going to Come. It's not like he was around for 5 years after, but I think that like Muhammad Ali is caught up in that and that too. Like whenever I see Muhammad Ali and sort of like the clips from the time, it's not hard to hear A Change Is Going to Come like in my own sort of head once I get Christopher Cross and sailing out of there. No, I'm kidding about Christopher Cross, but yeah,
oh, yacht rock guy, huh? Nice, man. Yeah, I don't know. Speculative history is always weird, but do you have any sort of speculation on what would have happened had Sam Cooke not died?
I have confident speculation on what would have happened if Sam Cooke wouldn't have died, because some artists are so unpredictable that we can predict what they're going to do in a sense that they're always going to be changing. And that's sort of like a watchword with Sam Cooke. But it's like, if I was around in 1970 and I listened to Bob Dylan, I have a pretty good clue that Bob Dylan was always going to be something different and do something different. Now, I might not have been like, oh, he's going to get into God and do all of this sort of like churchy music like around 1980. But even now, when Dylan has an album come out, you don't know what it's going to be. I think Melville was that way. I think about like James Joyce. You're like, oh, these Dubliners, this is so great. Then he's like, oh, okay, Ulysses. It's like, oh, all right, this is great too. But Finnegan's Wake, what are you doing to me, man? So I think Sam Cooke would have gone in like a Bob Dylan, a Miles Davis type of direction. I could have seen Sam Cooke doing Nick Drake style folk music with elements of sort of the fusion that Miles Davis got up to around the time of Bitches Brew. I think he would have really, to use a Dylan phrase, mixed up the medicine, and he wouldn't have stopped because he's a searcher. You've seen like the movie The Searchers. He's a quester. Some people just have a questing spirit, they can't stop ranging. And Sam Cooke was one of those artists. And before I could articulate it, I picked up on that. I knew it. And that's one reason why I found him so easy to love.
That's great, man. Anything you're working on now, Colin, that we should be checking out? I did put your website in the chat so everyone can check it out, and I highly recommend people go in there and check it out.
Yeah, so there's a blog on the website that's millions of words long that contains all sorts of music stuff and many things. And I had to write it down because I've finished like 5 books already this year. There's just always a lot of books. There's a new Beatles book, new jazz book, a new story collection where all the narrators or protagonists are women. There is a, like I mentioned, that Scrooge book that came out in December. So it's very much in the vein of the Sam Cooke book, except about a film. And the most recent book that came out this year is fiction. It's called If You Brackets, Fabula, Fantasy, Effery, swear word, Hope. And it's billed as like a punk rock triple album because they're like, I don't know what they said, 31 styles in it. It's different. It's good. Talked about it on the radio earlier tonight before coming on here.
Right, man. Well, hey, man, we just want to thank you so much for joining us tonight. This was fabulous. Like I said, we'll go ahead and get this video processed and send it out to everyone. I do want to give everyone a scoop that our last 33 1/3 with Mike McGonigal discussing My Bloody Valentine's Loveless is going to be Wednesday, May 25th, 7 to 8 Central Standard Time. I'll go ahead and put that registration link in the chat for everyone. But this has been a blast. Colin, you've been super generous with all your time. You've been super cool, like getting my texts, chatting with me on the phone, working out the Zoom stuff, man. So this has been just incredible, man. And I do love the book, and I can't recommend it enough for everyone who loves Sam Cooke or who loves this record. So with that, I guess I'll say goodnight.
All right, cool. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks, man. Good night, everyone.
Good night.